we doing, guys? Uh, I'm going to probably get back and work on that Prestige sequence I was working on, but the views have just dropped down to the point where I need to do something else to keep my content and my views up. Which this is an episode I've been working on for a while anyway, so it's not just like, oh, I need to make an episode that gets more views, but this is something I'm kind of itching to do, and it's very much in relationship with what Prestige is about anyway. Prestige has quite the legacy, as we've learned in these last 6 episodes. Like, it's really quite a well-established home for a lot of jazz greats, and in many ways, it's kind of ahead of where Blue Note is at the time. But what I want to talk to you about today is early Miles Davis and about some misconceptions that exist. Sometimes people talk about Miles' resurgence in 55, 56, and that would really be an overstating of the case. He's fairly anonymous all the way up into his signing with Columbia. And Columbia, within a few short years, certainly makes him a household name, especially in jazz circles. And I'm surprised how many people like me who still don't know who Miles Davis is, But again, I'm living in rural America where the focus on the black arts in America is non-existent. Black arts to these people is incarceration photos, your mug shot. Just the conception, the things people say, it's just so disturbing at times, but I don't want to get into that right now. What I want to talk about is Miles' early career. And again, it's not one filled with highlights and fame by any stretch of the imagination. He comes from St. Louis, heads to New York to go to Juilliard, if I remember right, and drops out quickly because he wants to find Parker, who he had seen a few years earlier in St. Louis. He comes from somewhat of a silver spoon, middle class, upper class for Black America. Father was a dentist, so he has some comfort and some entitlement, some sense of earning his place in society, and that he shouldn't have to question or defend it, which I think makes him very defensive. He was a boxer, a little guy. He was very insecure. It colors most of his persona, his playing, his off-putting persona with an audience, not facing them. A lot of it comes from his insecurities and his demons. And I think he's always trying to struggle and find his way. And a lot of what's become the persona of Miles is based off a later version of Miles who had money and kind of achieved a bourgeoisie lifestyle in spite of some of the misgivings that he still had and resentments he still had, being treated like a black man in America. I think his upbringing made him almost feel like, I'm not just your average black man. I come from money. And as Jay-Z can tell you, that doesn't make a difference. You still an N-word to most white Americans, especially in that time frame. But like I said, Jay-Z, his song 444, he talks about it. He's still just an N-word to a lot of America. No matter how much money he makes, no matter how successful he is, no matter how much he's not in prison or whatever, it doesn't seem to matter. So he's come to New York. He's looking for Parker. There's this scene that's been happening in New York and Harlem at Minton's Playhouse since the early 40s, where a lot of the great beboppers, Howard McGee, Thelonious Monk, Max Roach, Kenny Clark, Parker Gillespie, Bud Powell. These guys are all Al Haig. They're all getting together after hours at Minton's because they play in their various bands during the day, and they go and jam and they throw down. And Parker, during his days in the swing era in Kansas City, had kind of invented this new way of playing. And he didn't coin it bebop, but it became known as bebop. And it was a casting off of the boundaries and borders that chords leave us with, and embracing just entire scales and soloing and abandoning the melodic structure of the song that you hum along to. He's going to create melodies that are based off that same chords, but aren't going to reflect the standard melody, sometimes not at all. And this goes back to even Coleman Hawkins with Body and Soul in 1939, where he states the initial melody of the song and then just goes the rest of the way, just improvising, not really restating the melody or the theme, as it were. And if you hear that song after the 30-second mark, you're not going to really have that inclination that this is the track, body, and soul. The chords are there, but again, it's been distilled and extrapolated into a different context. They're using the notes and the chords in a different way. And a lot of it was very much at breakneck speed because it was about being dexterous as a player, knowing those scales, and being able to jump through those hoops, and to keep it somehow melodic and interesting. And that's the thing with a guy like Parker, is he's so innovative and it was a natural development for him. It wasn't a mathematical science breaking it down and going, let me rigidly try to figure this out scientifically. It was a feel for him. It was a effortless. His relationship with the music had become to the point where he had played so much that everything became clear. So you can study a subject to the point of transparency. And it was just, okay. And this fluid, melodic emoting comes out in Parker that next to nobody really captures the same way. The bebop in the hands of most of the guys was a race. It was an ego thing. It was driven by numbers and competition. And it's a different thing in the hands of most other players. With Parker, it was just this effortless expression, using more notes of the scale, not to prove anything, but just because they were there and he could adapt them and make them work and still resolve back at the end at the root and the tonic and make it feel good. And Monk takes his own approach, distilling it into these blocks and chops and spaces. But Parker was all about rhythm and pulse and really coloring in between the lines. And so Parker can't record these ideas because there's a war going on, there's a recording band going on. And so a lot of what Parker's developing along with the other cats at Minton's isn't getting out past Harlem. The black musicians in New York and some of the white musicians were aware of what was happening. And they were all coming up there trying to cut their chops and show what their abilities were. But it was still very much a movement that was happening very underground. And the recording band gets looked at in 45 as the war ends. And that allows kind of a scramble for the new recording industry to see what's new, what's hip, what's going on. And it's an interesting time in jazz. And it's really kind of one of the gateways where there's pre-war and post-war music. And there's still swing music to be recorded and put out in the late 40s, of course. It was still a massive horse. But rhythm and blues is really starting to ascend and changing the sound of the music. And jazz doesn't give way to rhythm and blues. Jazz becomes rhythm and blues. I think that's an important distinction to make. Jazz isn't being replaced by this thing. It's grafting into this thing. It was the direction the music had to take to remain popular, especially in the black community. And Tiny Bradshaw and Big Arthur Crudup and, of course, Louis Jordan. These guys are coming along, straightening out the beats some, stripping the band down to a more minimal thing, adding fun lyrics with choruses and kind of celebratory fun tones. Saturday Night Fish Fry. I mean, it was just fun. Listen to those Louis Jordan records and tell me not how fun they are. And James Brown credits Louis Jordan for being one of his main influences. And Louis Jordan owns the charts in the 40s. Just an incredible string of R&B hits that most white America doesn't really remember. And it was such a time, there was still race records. It was a different thing. And you can't go out and buy Louis Jordan LPs from that era. It was still the 78 era. So everything you buy from Louis Jordan is kind of compilations, mostly of that era. There is some stuff from like the mid-50s that you can get on Mercury, but Jordan was just a huge force. So the music is changing. And part of that countermeasure to jazz grafting into rhythm and blues and changing its look, sound, and facade was some of the key players in this new music knowing that the horse was out of the pen. The gate's open. This music isn't going to be what it once was in terms of commercial appeal. Rhythm and blues was taking over. Rhythm and blues kind of is the same as rock and roll in the late 40s. There's stuff that's kind of titled early rock and roll hits, and it's really just rhythm and blues hits. And that's just because rock and roll is really rhythm and blues. And even up to up into the present. It's amazing how much rhythm and blues you hear in rock and roll, how much blues you hear in rock and roll. It was for fun listening to some Motley Crue live for their Goodbye concert in L.A. And there must be some overdubs in that because it sounds really good. And they're not a band that ever sounded really good live. But Mick Mars, who's I never really thought was a great guitar player. Most people don't. But then I was listening to his sliding and the amount of blues in his playing, his riffs, his bending, everything about him is just kind of a feel blues. He's quoting the blues a lot. Even when he's not playing a blues riff per se, he's playing very much in a blues vernacular. And so blues is his omnipresent thing. And so as the music's changing, bebop says we need to come to the forefront and do our recordings. And Savoy and Bruce and a few small labels, Dial, are like, let's record this stuff. And so what we're listening to right here is some stuff from 45 on the Savoy label. Of course, this is the 12-inch issue of it from 55, not the music from 45. But it is the music from 45. It's just not the initial way it was released. Okay, but Savoy is compiling a lot of Parker material in the early days of the LP from the 40s and putting it out there for the consumers to grab all that Parker stuff. And again, the Parker stuff doesn't sell really that well, on the 10-inch or even on the 12-inch. I mean, the old 78s. Parker's music's not catching the world on fire. What it is catching every other player in the music industry on fire. And so guys like Dizzy Gillespie come along, and Parker and Bird were friends, but it was a strained relationship. Dizzy was very much a fun, easygoing, lucky living fella, personality for days, wasn't really an addict in the same sense. I don't know if he did drugs at all, but he certainly wasn't an addict in the sense of Parker and Miles and a lot of the other cats that they were. And so Dizzy has a hard time and lacks the patience to really be the support that Parker would have needed. And so Dizzy really only goes his own way, and they really do their own separate things. And Dizzy's records don't really sell like they should either. And Savoy also documents some of his stuff from this period. They don't record together as much as people think. But Dizzy was a great educator, understood the mathematics of what Bird was doing. Like I said, Bird was doing it naturally. And Gillespie could understand the mathematics and was able to teach a lot of people how to play bebop. And Dizzy tries to bring bebop to the big band. And he has this incredible big band through the early 40s and the late 40s, early 50s that houses so many of the greats of the Prestige Blue Note era. Well, these guys played in that Gillespie big band, and Gillespie was trying to bring bebop to a bigger band setting, where there was some arrangements and some bebop and some blues, and none of it really catches on for Dizzy, sadly. So Miles is part of that mix. He's found Bird. He's clinging on to his coattails in a sense. Miles was a young trumpet player who doesn't really have the chops or the viscosity or the fluidity to play bebop in that sense, like a Bird or a Gillespie could. And he was never going to be first trumpet in any of these groups. However, Gillespie was a very accommodating fella. And there's recording sessions where Gillespie moves himself over to the piano, where he was actually a great pianist, and allows Miles to play first trumpet on some of these records. And Miles is very much a developing guy, but he's never the star of these recordings. He's never the focal point of these recordings. His solos pass by rather uneventfully. His tone is kind of clouded and milky at times. He has little bursts of innovation and light at times where you can see he gets it, and he's got the knowledge from Juilliard and schooling and his upbringing. He's got the understanding of it. It just never really was the player that he was. And that's not a criticism. We all have our own styles. Some guys just can't go out there and start playing a style that's not really their forte. So moving forward here, moving into 1946, Miles is still very much an anonymous sideman. And Billy Eckstein has this great big band that I've talked about numerous times here. And he's recording at Emercy here in 1946. And Miles ends up backing some of these tracks. I'll be honest, there's not really any aha moments in there. He's not featured where you're like, okay, here's going to be Miles' 32 bars. He's just one of players on the session that's anonymous, like most of the other players. Eckstein was a show, and those weren't bebop records; those were singing records. So any soloist is going to get a minimal space to do what he does anyway. More in 47, more Parker stuff. And Miles is on these as well. You know, you got Bud Powell on some of this stuff, Max Roach. Tiny Grimes plays guitar on some of these. Tommy Potter's on the bass. Uh, Again, Parker he actually does record a lot. A lot of it's overdubs and not overdubs, but just takes and outtakes and false starts. But you're hearing Parker was that important that everything gets put out eventually. So the good takes plus the bad takes all get released. And because Parker was capable of doing this flurry of inventiveness on a bad take that makes that 30 seconds of that take worthwhile because Parker was so creative. The recording's quality of these is post-war. It's the beginning of a new sound in terms of recording capabilities. We haven't quite got to where we're going to be in the 50s with the sound quality. Parker also works for the Dial label, and this is a box set, a lot of records, 5 or 6 records if I remember. And Miles appears on a lot of these sessions from 47 and 48 as well with Bird. And again, he's just a kid kind of finding his way. Also in 47, 48, he shows up in a few sessions on this session. Again, this is an LP on Imperial that comes out in 55 or 6. But actually 61 it looks like. But it's from 47. And the band here is Coleman Hawkins, Howard McGee, and Lester Young. So Giants and Lester and Hawkins both kind of embrace bebop to some degree. And Miles shows up on a few tracks on this. And again, he's very much unheralded and not really that noticeable. He's just, sometimes he seems to become more noticeable as he got more famous. Like, oh, Miles is on that. But you're not going to write home because Miles is on that. In 1950, he records with Sarah Vaughan on this session, which gets reissued on Columbia on 12-inch as Sarah Vaughan in Hi-Fi in 1955, 56, number 745 in the Columbia discography. This is a low-budget reissue that they put out probably in the 60s or 70s, but this is the original cover of that. They don't even add songs for the 12-inch. It's the same songs. Vocal songs never tend to be as long. And even though Miles is on this, and I've seen it from numerous sources, the band listed here is as follows. Jimmy Jones on the piano, who works with Sonny Stitt a lot. Bud Johnson, great tenor player, Texas tenorman. Benny Green is on the trombone, a very fluid, soulful bonus that ends up at both Prestige and Blue Note. Tony Scott, Bill Evans' friend, who's a clarinetist, who becomes kind of a Zen guy in the 60s. But in the 50s, he was quite a hard-swinging, edges of bebop guy. Mundell Lowe's on the guitar, along with Freddie Green. Freddie Green, of course, was the great guitar player from Basie's group and really just a rhythm player that added color and chords. Mundell Lowe was a bit more of an intricate lead solo player who was actually friends with Bill Evans and went to school with him as well. Billy Taylor's on the piano, and Billy Taylor's on the bass. Maybe that's a different Billy Taylor. And then J.C. Hurd's on the drums, and Hurd has quite a career as well. And you don't even have Miles on the trumpet even listed here. I mean, and I've seen numerous sources on it. I remember listening for trumpet. I think I found him in a few places. It's been a while, but there was, again, nothing to really write home about. So moving on, we're going to jump here to 1952, which is a recording he does live with Jimmy Forrest. Doesn't come out till years later. Not a great sounding recording. At the time, Jimmy Forrest was as big a name from the rhythm and blues backing that he had some hits in the early 50s, late 40s that were more R&B tinged. Here he is playing at the Barrel, live at the Barrel, and Miles Davis is in the group. And Miles doesn't look like that. That's Miles much later. The picture of Jimmy Forrest looks more correct from that era, but that's definitely an older Miles there. Again, this comes out years later, once Miles' fame has long been established. So that's some of his side work. Let's look at what he does as a leader here. In the late 40s, The Birth of the Cool is a really well-known record today. And this is the version that comes out in 1957 on Capitol with the cover that we all know. But again, this is the 12-inch LP release of it. And this originally was recorded in 49 and 50, or maybe 49 and 51. It's three different sessions actually, with three different groups of members, who've only about 3 or 4 of them appear on every session. And Jerry Mulligan, Lee Konitz are two of the prime guys. Gil Evans is on a lot of it. J.J. Johnson's on a lot of it. Kenny Clark's on some of it. There's lots of who's who of who's in jazz at this point. They'd been hanging out. Mulligan was trying to kind of take the music in a different direction, which again, what a lot of the great white composers in jazz were trying to do, adding new compositions to the jazz canon. And so Mulligan's kind of the leader of the session in a lot of ways. The charts and arrangements, he's putting them together. And Mulligan became a very in-demand arranger throughout the 50s and 60s. Mulligan becomes a pretty big star. As this music was recorded, Capitol issues a few 78s of it. Not much fanfare. And it's not really a Miles Davis session. I've said it numerous times. And Mulligan gets mad as Capitol reissues it a few times and makes it seem like it's just a Miles Davis creation. Mulligan was pretty bitter about it, I've read, for most of his career. And it was so not important that Capitol, that jumps into the 12-inch LP in 54, doesn't get around to issuing this, what you would think would be one of the first things they'd put out on the 12-inch, until number 762 in 57. It takes them like 2 or 3 years to be like, oh, we should probably put that Miles Davis out. And of course, by 57, Miles Davis' career at Columbia is really starting to jump. And so it takes Miles Davis becoming really popular at the other big label, their main competitor, Columbia, for Capitol to say, hey, let's go back into the vaults and repackage that Burst of the Cool stuff, which it wasn't even called initially. And so it's very much a hindsight session recording that Miles gets too much credit for. He's a part of it, but by no means is he the main impetus or creative force. There's a lot of great players. The stuff, it's a little bit dated, if I'm honest. Part of that's just the recording sounds of it, but it's very melancholic. It's got some European sound in it. It's as much the birth of Third Stream in some ways as it is the Cool. It's got some elements of the Cool, but a lot of the Cool that I think of as the Cool sounds quite different than what this sounds like. And there's some Third Stream stuff that kind of lends itself towards this, partly because there's things like French horns and tubas. Some interesting instruments appear on this recording. So, again, Miles Davis was a fairly anonymous force at this point, and it's in hindsight where he's been given more credit than he deserves. In 1951, about 8 months after he does that work at Capitol, he does his first recordings for Prestige in 1951. This is Miles Davis and his horns, featuring Al Cohn, Zoot Sims, John Lewis, Sonny Rollins. Rollins was probably a bigger name than Miles Davis was at this point. Of course, playing with Parker gives Miles some credibility and some name recognition, but very little. Not very much at all. And so these recordings were done fairly anonymously, with the sidemen being as big as the leader was. Al Cohn and Zoot Sims, of course, were white stars and had probably bigger followings than Miles or Rollins, although it's hard to really judge 1951. I'm trying to think back. Everyone was kind of ascending at that point. And of course, John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet. But it's interesting stuff, and it doesn't sound that different from the Birth of the Cool in terms of its age of recordings and the tonalities of everything. It's really not the best sounding Miles. I listened to it twice the other day, and I did find some interesting stuff on there. But if I'm honest, it's Rollins that I noticed by far the most. And I think Rollins, when Rollins is in the right headspace, is just brilliant. You know, when Rollins has got a little bit of hunger in him, he can be quite the voice and quite outstanding. Then in 51 again, and again, this one has a bit of a vacuous tone to it. It's just the era the recording that it's from. I was trying to find some songs I wanted to kind of show for people. This is the track Denial. Again, there's that kind of cloudy tone. It's not crystalline like a Clifford or a Freddie. It's starting to have some modernity to it, but it's still very much post-war sounding in a lot of ways. Out of the Blue is a beautiful ballad on side 2 that Rollins and Miles play wonderfully on. This track, Denial, here is nice up-tempo in the bebop form. And Rollins, I remember, again, it's Rollins that really kind of kicks my ass on this. It's called Dig, Prestige 7012. And I'm going to actually show you these in their sequential timeline, not their Prestige release timeline. So they're going to be very different. So this is a lot of stuff from 50, 51, 52, what we're looking at. Pull that down. I don't want to get this demonetized. In 51, this is part of that dig session. This is Conception. It has 2 different covers. I showed it to you recently in one of my other episodes. But again, Rollins and Miles do a couple tracks on here. And the version of My Old Flame on this is gorgeous. The Miles and Rollins only have 2 songs on here. Because it's an LP shared with a lot of Prestige stars at this point. You have Stan Getz, you got Jerry Mulligan, you have Connitz. All these guys have different tracks on the record that they're kind of scraps they were putting together to make this release number 7013. But here we got Miles. He's not muted yet. He's not really delved into that side of his career yet. But he's contemplative. He sounds earnest. There's a bit of humility there. And humility is often masked in insecure people. Insecure people are obviously very humble, but they're overcompensating, so the humility doesn't come across often. And I think when Miles is vulnerable, he's at his best. That's part of why I like Seven Steps to Heaven. I don't think he has the confidence and the bravado that he had during that first quintet or later with the second quintet. So whenever he's feeling vulnerable, I find him to be very introspective and honest and exposing himself. Some beautiful tonality there. So the side of Miles we don't hear a lot of him playing soft, slow, unmuted. So that's a great record to find if you can come across it. So moving into 1952, he signs with Blue Note, does just a few sessions. Art Blakey, Percy Heath, J.J. Johnson, Horace Silver, Jackie McLean, Kenny Clark. Numerous musicians show up on these sessions. And they find Miles kind of where he is at this point. Not a name brand by any means. It's all taken from at least 4 sessions, if I remember. And a lot of it comes out on 10-inch era Blue Note. And it's compiled on these 2 12-inch LPs in 1955. And again, when Blue Note launches their LP sequence from the 10-inch era into the LPs, 1500 sequence is where they start. And number 1 and number 2 are these Miles Davis records. And it's not because of Miles' reputation on these recordings. It's because Miles' reputation on Columbia has made his name ascend. And so even Blue Note's like, let's put these out first. Hopefully we can capture some trickle-down effect from Miles' success over at Columbia now. So it's an interesting road that Miles is weaving here. And people often seem to make it seem like he was this giant with Parker and Birth of the Cool, and he kind of faded away for a while and then kind of comes back. That's just not the case. He was never really that ascended to the great heights that people think until Columbia. And I'm going to give you some great example here. This is from 1953, Miles Davis and Lighthouse All-Stars. And it's on the Contemporary label. It's on the West Coast. For those of you who don't know, the Lighthouse is a place on Hermosa Beach in the LA area on the ocean where the great Howard Rumsey hosted a great jazz group there. And the members of the Howard Rumsey All-Stars changed throughout the 50s. And it's a who's who, especially of West Coast players, but a lot of East Coast players come through. Some black players even come through. Max Roach was in the group for a while. This is a recording of Miles Davis sitting in with the All-Stars. And I'm going to read you this right up here, because I think it is very telling. In 1953, all right, 53, Miles Davis sat in one Sunday afternoon at the Lighthouse. No big deal. Lots of people sat in at the Lighthouse. And Davis was no more famous than most and less famous than many. Fame, big fame, was 2 or 3 years away from Miles, which is what I've been saying. There was no compelling reason to issue the recordings made that afternoon. Contemporaries Les Koenig probably figured he had more interesting all-star material in the can. So the tapes sat around for 3 decades. And when they emerged, guess what? They were interesting, not just historically, but musically. Miles solos on classics by Monk and Dizzy, and on a Shorty Rogers original that has an affinity for Thad Cameron's Good Bait. The other tracks are intriguing drum solo by Max Roach, a lovely ballad by guest Chet Baker, who was a more efficient and prominent trumpet player at this point, and Russ Freeman on the piano is a great player. This was just another Sunday at the Lighthouse. And so Miles Davis sitting in didn't make Lester Koenig and Contemporary go, oh, let's put that out. That's going to be huge. The tapes got lost. The amount of people that came through that group were all-star after all-star. And even the people on these recordings, Rolf Erickson, not a huge name. Bud Shank, huge name in white jazz in the 50s and 60s. Bob Cooper, huge name in the 50s and 60s. Lorraine Geller, Herb Geller's wife. Herb Geller's a great saxophonist. Lorraine Geller was a fantastic piano player. Very forgotten today, sadly. Howard Rumsey's on the bass and Max Roach is on the drums. So that band's already legendary. So a guy like Miles Davis or Rolf Erickson sitting in didn't have a whole lot of cachet. The members that have come through the Rumsey All-Stars is a who's who, especially of West Coast talent. And so that just gives you some perspective on how Miles was in 52, 53, 54. He's not really anybody. Contrary to a lot of modern opinions about where Miles was.